The scent of fermented yeast and cheap, salty margarine didn't just cling to Amara's skin. It was the heavy, inescapable fragrance of her survival. For years, she had walked exactly 3 paces behind her mother's rhythmic, melodic cry, a silent shadow clutching a battered plastic tub of butter and a stack of old newspapers for wrapping. In those dusty streets, she wasn't a student or a dreamer, she was the girl who held the grease. But in the sweltering, uncompromising heat of a Lagos afternoon, the rhythm that had governed her life suddenly snapped. The bread went cold in the tray, the bustling streets fell into a terrifying silence, and the hand she had followed for 2 decades finally went limp. As the world blurred around her, Amara realized that the grief threatening to swallow her whole was also a forge. To honor the woman who had traded her youth for flour and water, Amara would have to stop trailing behind. She would have to take the crumbs of her tragedy and bake them into a kingdom of her own. The sun over Mushin didn't just rise. It aggressive took ownership of the day. By 5 a.m., the air, already thick with the scent of fermented yeast and the previous day's uncollected refuse, began to shimmer with oncoming heat. For Amara and her mother, Mama Nkechi, the alarm clock was not a buzzing digital device but the heavy thud of the bakery truck delivering the first batch of aged bread to the distribution point down the street. Their home, a single room in a face-me-I-face-you tenement compound, was a symphony of early morning activity. 12 families sharing 1 bathroom and 2 kitchens meant that survival was often measured in minutes gained or lost. Amara, 20 years old but carrying the weary eyes of someone much older, was already awake, sitting on the thin mattress that dominated the small space. The rhythmic, rattling cough from the other side of the room told her that Mama Nkechi had also joined the waking. "Neen, drink this," Amara said softly, pressing a plastic mug of warm water mixed with a spoonful of honey against her mother's hand. Mama Nkechi's hand, calloused from decades of carrying trays and counting greasy naira notes, was trembling. "My daughter," she whispered, her voice rough. "Today will be a good day. The air is still. That means the labours in Oshodi will be hungry." Every day was a gamble based on the weather, the mood of the area boys, and the reliability of the bakery. But for Amara, the routine was as predictable as the tide. While other young women her age were perhaps applying face cream or choosing outfits for school or work, Amara's morning ritual was different. She didn't wear perfume. She wore the heavy, sweet, slightly sour scent of cheap margarine and hot dough. It was her uniform, her identity, the fragrance of their existence. By 6 a.m., they were on the move. Mama Nkechi, still possessing a regal posture despite her internal fatigue, carried the primary load, a massive, cloth-covered wooden tray piled high with hundreds of loaves of fresh bread, perfectly balanced on her head. Amara, trailing exactly 3 paces behind, was the logistics manager. She held the essential butter set, a deep blue plastic tub, its lid warped from use, containing a large block of yellow margarine, and a stack of old newspapers, torn into perfect squares for wrapping the loaves. Their walk was a carefully choreographed dance. Mama Nkechi led, her voice cutting through the morning chaos with a melodic, resonant cry that was recognized throughout the neighborhood. "Buy your hot bread. Soft and sweet. Get your fresh bread here." Amara's role was silent but critical. A customer would hail them. Mama Nkechi would stop with surgical precision. Amara would immediately step forward, hand her mother a square of newspaper, and then, using a large metal spoon, scoop a generous portion of margarine into the opened loaf. It was a rapid-fire transaction, perfected over years. The exchange of greasy notes for warm carbohydrate was a fleeting moment of connection in the sprawling anonymity of the Lagos morning. For Amara, this path was meant to be temporary. The year before, 2018, had been defined by candles burned low and pages turned until her eyes ached. She had poured every ounce of her frustration and ambition into her university entrance exams. The singular goal was to escape. To walk 3 paces behind anyone was not the future she envisioned. One afternoon, in a scene that would forever be etched in her memory, Amara had returned to their cramped room to find her mother sitting on the floor, the admission letter for the University of Lagos clutched in her hand. Mama Nkechi hadn't been able to read the sophisticated English, but she understood the seal, the letterhead, and the look in her daughter's eyes. She had wept, the tears carving clean channels through the flour dust on her face. "You will not hold the butter tub forever," she had promised, pulling Amara into an embrace that smelled of dough and a fierce, protective love. To celebrate, Mama Nkechi had bought a single bottle of Coca-Cola and poured it into 2 plastic cups. They had clinked their glasses, the small bubbles a brief, fizzy celebration of a mountain scaled. The admission was a beacon, a promise that the endless walking and the perpetual scent of margarine had a destination. But by 2019, the light from that beacon had started to flicker. Mama Nkechi's cough, once a seasonal visitor, became a permanent resident in their room. Her step grew slower, the magnificent balance on her head harder to maintain. The heavy tray seemed to be crushing her, one loaf at a time. Amara tried to ignore it, focusing instead on her impending studies. But she noticed. She noticed when her mother started using the wall for support. She noticed when the money she counted at night began to dwindle because they couldn't cover the usual distance. She noticed the sweat on her mother's brow was cold, even in the afternoon heat. The breaking point arrived with the terrifying clarity of an air raid siren. One particularly sweltering Tuesday, they were navigating a treacherous stretch of unpaved road in Age. A large gutter, perpetually overflowing with greenish water, required careful navigation. "By your hot." The cry was severed. Amara, looking up from the butter tub, watched in slow motion as the massive bread tray tilted. Mama Nkechi didn't trip. Her legs simply gave out, the strength evaporating from her body as if she were a puppet whose strings had been cut. The tray crashed, and for a singular, horrific moment, the street was filled with a shower of hundreds of white loaves, scattered like large hail across the muddy ground. The blue plastic butter tub slipped from Amara's hands, the lid popping off to reveal the yellow block, now exposed to the dirt. A hush fell over the immediate area, the traffic seeming to pause. Amara didn't scream. She dropped to her knees in the mud, her heart pounding against her ribs with a force that felt like it might fracture them. Mama, wake up." Mama Nkechi was conscious but grey. Her eyes were unfocused, her breathing shallow and raspy, a wet, rattling sound. She was looking at the scattered bread, at the ruin of their day, of their week, and her hand made a feeble, heartbreaking motion towards a nearby loaf, as if to apologize for the mess. With the help of some sympathetic passers-by, Amara managed to get her mother to a nearby chemist shop, where the attendant, after a brief examination, gave a stern look. "This one is serious," he said, handing Amara a pack of generic cough suppressants and antibiotics. "Her lungs are weary. She cannot be carrying this kind of weight. She needs rest. Real rest. And she needs a doctor." Doctor. The word landed with the weight of a guilty verdict. A doctor meant money they didn't have. It meant the university fee fund. They returned to Mushin in a tricycle, a luxury they had never permitted themselves. The scattered bread was left behind, a feast for the neighborhood dogs and a symbol of their broken world. For the next week, Mama Nkechi remained alit in their small room. The once bustling compound felt stifling to Amara as she watched her mother battle the deep, painful coughs that racked her thin frame. Amara was trapped. Every day she spent at home was a day without income. The savings, the precious, guarded stack of notes intended for her first semester, were disappearing into medicine and the cost of food that Mama Nkechi was too weak to eat. Amara would look at her mother, the woman who had been her sun and her shield, and feel an agonizing blend of love, guilt, and terror. Her future at the university was a bright, shimmering island that was receding with every cough. Every day they remained still. She was no longer walking 3 paces behind her mother. She was standing still, watching the tide of their poverty begin to rise, threatening to engulf them both. The transition from a shadow to a leader happened not with a ceremony, but with the cold, metallic click of a padlock. It was a Monday morning, a time when the rest of Lagos seemed to be vibrating with a renewed, frantic energy. Amara stood in the center of their small room, her eyes fixed on the wooden tray leaning against the wall. It looked different now, larger, more ominous, like an altar demanding a sacrifice. On the bed, Mama Nkechi was a silhouette of her former self, her breathing rhythmic but shallow, a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "Amara," her mother whispered, her voice barely catching the light. "The yeast, it doesn't wait for grief." Amara didn't respond. She couldn't. Her throat felt as though it were filled with the very flour dust that had eventually betrayed her mother's lungs. She reached for the tray. It was heavier than she remembered from the few times she had helped lift it onto her mother's head. As she hoisted it up, the wood groaned against her scalp. She positioned the coiled cloth, the carter, to cushion the pressure, but the weight was uncompromising. It pressed down through her spine, grounding her into the dirt floor. Then came the butter tub. She picked up the blue plastic container, now cleaned of the mud from the previous week's disaster. She tucked it under her arm, grabbed the stack of newspapers, and stepped out into the blinding glare of the Mushin morning. For the first hour, Amara was paralyzed by a profound, suffocating shame. This was the year she was supposed to be walking through the gates of the University of Lagos, a leather satchel over her shoulder and a pen in her hand. Instead, she was wearing a faded wrapper and a t-shirt stained with the ghosts of old margarine spills. Every time she saw a group of young people in pressed uniforms or trendy clothes, she tilted the tray forward, using the wall of bread to hide her face. Her voice, when she finally tried to call out, was a pathetic, strangled thing. "Bread." she croaked. Buy your bread. The chaotic roar of the street swallowed her words instantly. A yellow Danfo bus screeched past, coughing black soot into her face. An Okada rider swerved around her, shouting an obscenity. The world didn't care about her shame. It only cared about its own momentum. She stood at a crossroads near the bustling Oshodi market, her neck aching, her legs trembling. She realized then that if she failed today, Mama Nkechi wouldn't have medicine by nightfall. The shame didn't feed the sick, only the hustle did. Amara took a deep breath, tasting the exhaust and the salt. She thought of the scholar bread seller she wanted to be. If she had to do this, she would do it with the precision of the mathematician she was trained to be. She stopped hiding. She straightened her back, letting the weight of the tray become a part of her center of gravity. Buy your hot bread, she screamed, the sound tearing from her chest. Soft aged bread, butter inside, fresh from the oven. It worked. A mechanic, his hands stained with engine oil, whistled at her. Oya, scholar. Give me 2, with plenty butter. Amara moved with a frantic, newfound speed. She didn't just scoop the margarine. She sliced the bread with a practiced flick of a small knife she'd tucked into her waist, spread the yellow cream with an evenness that spoke of hidden standards, and wrapped it tight in the newspaper. By midday, the sun was a hammer, and the time of masks had begun to settle over the city. While the specific dates were blurred in the haze of her labor, the atmosphere was shifting. People were more hurried, their faces partially covered by scraps of cloth as rumors of a distant sickness began to drift through the markets like a foul wind. But the hunger remained. Amara noticed something her mother never had. She noticed the patterns of the commuters. She realized that the bus drivers at the back of the park were hungrier than the ones at the front because they had longer to wait before their turn to load. She moved to the back. She realized that the women selling roasted groundnuts were her best allies. She began to offer a bundle deal, bread and nuts for a discounted price, splitting the small margin with the groundnut sellers. She was applying the logic of a girl who had aced her entrance exams to the ancient art of the street hawker. She wasn't just walking, she was optimizing. One evening, as the sky turned a bruised purple and the streetlights of the richer districts began to flicker on in the distance, Amara was heading toward a shortcut. Her tray was nearly empty, only 4 loaves remained. Her feet were swollen, her skin coated in a fine, grey grit. As she stepped off a curb near a more affluent residential strip bordering the slum, a sleek, black SUV tore around the corner. The driver didn't see her. The screech of tires on asphalt was a high-pitched scream. Amara threw herself backward, the tray slipping from her head. She landed hard on her side, the remaining loaves tumbling into the dust. The SUV jerked to a halt, the door flying open. Amara prepared herself to be yelled at, the common fate of the poor who dared to get in the way of the fast. But the woman who stepped out was in a state of sheer terror. She was young, dressed in expensive lace that was now wrinkled and soaked. She leaned against the car door, clutching her protruding stomach, her breath coming in jagged, terrifying gasps. Please, the woman moaned, her eyes rolling back. The driver, he ran. I tried to drive myself, the hospital. Amara forgot her bruised hip. She forgot the 4 wasted loaves. She saw a woman who was about to bring life into a world that was currently trying to break them both. Madam, stay calm, Amara said, her voice dropping into a low, authoritative tone she didn't know she possessed. She looked around. The street was deserted. The SUV was blocked by a pile of construction sand. Amara didn't have a car, and she couldn't drive this beast of a machine. But she knew the rhythm of the city. She ran to the main road, waving her arms frantically until an Okada rider slowed down. 5,000 naira. Amara shouted, pulling the crumpled notes from her bra, her entire day's profit. Take this woman to the St. Nicholas Clinic. Now. I will follow. The rider, seeing the desperation and the pregnant woman, nodded. Amara helped the woman onto the bike, bracing her from behind until the rider took off. Amara watched them disappear into the gloom. She stood alone on the street, her money gone, her bread ruined, and her body aching. She walked home in the dark, empty-handed. When she reached the room, she expected Mama Nkechi to be disappointed. Instead, her mother looked at her dusty, bruised daughter and saw something more than a bread seller. You have the heart of a queen, Amara, the old woman wheezed. And queens do not starve. God has seen your butter and your bread today. The weeks turned into months. The world grew stranger. The temporals of their lives were marked by the rising price of flour and the growing silence of the streets as the city moved into the middle of 2020. Amara's routine became a grim battle of attrition. She would wake up, check her mother's temperature, and then head out into a city that was increasingly afraid of its own breath. She learned to navigate the police checkpoints, slipping a loaf of bread to the board officers to let her pass into the green zones where the wealthy lived. She became a fixture. People began to look for the scholar. She was the girl who always had a book tucked into the side of her bread tray, reading chapters of economics or literature while she waited for the bakery to open at 4 a.m. But the victory was hollow. No matter how many loaves she sold, no matter how many bundle deals she brokered, she couldn't outrun the biology of her mother's failing body. The medicine was no longer working. The cough had changed. It was no longer dry and raspy. It was wet, heavy, and sounded like the tide coming in. By the early part of 2021, a strange, tense hope had begun to return to Lagos. But for Amara, the air was running out. She sat by the bed one night, the room lit by a single, flickering candle. The scent of yeast was everywhere, but it no longer smelled like life. It smelled like a ticking clock. Amara, Mama Nkechi said, her hand reaching out to find her daughter's. Her grip was surprisingly strong. Promise me, when the bread is finished, you don't stay in the kitchen. You go to the table. You belong at the table. I promise, Mama. Amara sobbed, kissing the hand that had carried her through the dirt. But you have to be there to see it. Mama Nkechi didn't answer. She only closed her eyes, the rhythmic sound of her breath the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. Amara knew the morning would come, and with it, the tray, the butter, and the long walk. She just didn't know it would be the last time she would ever walk behind someone else. The sky over Lagos in the midpoint of 2021 was a bruised, heavy purple, bloated with a rain that refused to fall. It was the kind of heat that didn't just sit on the skin. It pushed against the lungs, making every breath a conscious effort. For Amara, the air in their single room had become a physical weight. The scent of yeast, once a symbol of daily bread, now smelled like fermentation and decay. Mama Nkechi lay on the mattress, her body appearing smaller than the blankets covering her. The rhythmic hiss-pop of her breathing had slowed to a terrifying cadence. Each silence between breaths felt like a canyon Amara had to leap across. I'm going out, Mama, Amara whispered, leaning over to press a damp cloth to her mother's forehead. The bakery had a surplus today. If I sell quickly, I can buy the blue inhaler the chemist mentioned. The one that works. Mama Nkechi didn't open her eyes, but her fingers twitched against the sheet. A silent dismissal, or perhaps a blessing. Amara hoisted the tray. Her neck muscles, now roped with the permanent tension of the trade, barely protested. She stepped out into the mush in morning, but the atmosphere felt fractured. The usual roar of the city was muffled, as if the world were holding its breath. The temporals of the day were skewed. The sun was a pale, sickly disk behind the clouds, providing light without warmth. She sold with a desperation that bordered on manic. She didn't wait for customers to hail her. She chased the yellow Danfo buses as they slowed for potholes, thrusting wrapped loaves through open windows before the conductors could even shout. She ignored the ache in her shins and the stinging sweat in her eyes. Just 10 more loaves. Just 5. By the time the last loaf was sold, the first fat drops of rain began to pelt the dusty streets, turning the grey earth into a slick, treacherous paste. Amara tucked the empty butter tub under her arm and began to run. She didn't care about the rain. She cared about the silence she had left behind in that room. When she burst through the door, the smell hit her first. Not the smell of sickness, but the smell of an absence. Mama Nkechi was sitting up, propped against the wall. Her eyes were wide, staring at a patch of peeling paint on the opposite side of the room. Her chest was heaving, a wet, jagged sound that filled the small space like a broken engine. Mama. Amara dropped the butter tub. The blue plastic skittered across the floor, spilling the remaining greasy coins. Amara. The air, it's gone. Her mother gasped. Amara didn't hesitate. She grabbed a shawl, wrapped it around her mother's shivering frame, and lifted her. Mama Nkechi weighed nothing. She was a bird made of bone and memory. Amara carried her out into the torrential downpour. The street was a river of mud. The rain was so thick it was like walking through a beaded curtain. Amara stood on the corner, screaming for a vehicle. Taxi, please. Hospital. Several cars splashed past, their drivers peering through blurred windshields and seeing only a drenched girl holding a dying woman, a complication they couldn't afford. Finally, an old, battered Toyota Corolla with a God's Grace sticker peeling off the bumper slowed down. The driver rolled down the window just an inch. Where you to go? I'd a close for day. Luth. Lagos University Teaching Hospital. Amara sobbed, thrusting her hand through the gap. She wasn't holding out her hand for a handshake. She was holding the entire day's earnings, the bread money, the butter money, the inhaler money. Take it. Take everything. Just drive. The driver saw the wet, crumpled notes and the desperation in Amara's eyes. He unlocked the door. Amara scrambled into the backseat, pulling her mother into her lap. The interior of the taxi smelled of stale tobacco and cheap air freshener. She cradled Mama Nkechi's head against her chest, rocking her as the car jolted over the flooded potholes of Age Motor Road. We're almost there, Mama. Hold on. The doctors, they have the machines. They have the air. Mama Nkechi looked up at her daughter. For a moment, the fog in her eyes cleared. She reached up, her wet, cold hand found Amara's cheek. She didn't look like a woman in pain. She looked like someone who had finally finished a very long walk. Amara, she whispered, the sound barely audible over the drumming of the rain on the car's tin roof. Don't look back at the tray. Look at the university. Hush, Mama. Rest. I am resting. The hand on Amara's cheek went limp. It slid down, trailing a wet smear of rain and salt across Amara's neck, before falling heavily onto the cracked vinyl of the seat. The hiss-pop stopped. The silence that followed was louder than the storm outside. Amara sat perfectly still. She didn't scream. She didn't cry out to the driver to go faster. She simply tightened her grip on the cooling body in her arms. The taxi continued to splash through the deep puddles, the windshield wipers clicking back and forth. Left, right, life, death, left, right. By the time they pulled up to the emergency entrance of the hospital, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. The driver turned around, his face softened by a sudden, heavy realization. Sister, he said softly, we are here. Amara looked at the bright, fluorescent lights of the hospital lobby. They looked like stars, distant and cold. She's gone, Amara said, her voice sounding like it belonged to a stranger. The driver didn't ask for the rest of the money. He helped her carry the body inside, staying with her until the nurses moved Mama Nkechi onto a gurney and covered her face with a white sheet. The final newspaper wrapping for a life spent in the service of others. The following days were a blur of grey light and the hollow sound of her own footsteps in an empty room. The funeral was small, a few neighbors, the groundnut sellers, and the mechanic who always bought extra butter. They looked at Amara with pity, seeing a girl who had lost her son and was now destined to wander the streets until the darkness took her too. But Amara was done with the streets. 3 days after the burial, the temporals of the city shifted again. It was that brief window in late 2021 when the world felt like it was finally, truly waking up from its long slumber. Amara walked past a community center and saw a crowd gathered around a notice board. A large, glossy flyer caught the light. Global Relief Organization, Grow Recruitment Drive. Seeking logistics officers, field coordinators, and administrative assistants. Requirements, university-level aptitude, resilience, and local knowledge. Amara looked at her hands. They were still stained with the faint yellow tint of margarine. Her shoes were worn thin from the miles of Lagos asphalt. She had no fancy suit, no polished resume. All she had was the admission letter to Unileg, the one she had never been able to use, and the memory of a woman who told her she belonged at the table. She walked into the recruitment hall. The room was filled with standard Nigerians, young men in crisp white shirts and women in high heels, clutching leather portfolios and talking about synergy and scalability. Amara sat in the back, her worn wrapper tucked around her legs, her face scrubbed clean but her eyes burning with a cold, hard light. When her name was finally called, she walked into a small office where 2 Europeans and a stern-looking Nigerian man sat behind a table. Name? The Nigerian man asked, not looking up from his tablet. Amara Nkechi Okocha. Experience. I managed a high-volume, perishable goods distribution network in the Mushin and Age districts for 3 years, Amara said. Her voice didn't tremble. The man looked up then, his eyebrows arching. A distribution network? Which company? My mother's tray, Amara replied. The younger European woman leaned forward, intrigued. You mean you were a street hawker? I was a logistics manager, Amara corrected her. I managed inventory that spoiled in 6 hours. I navigated volatile market conditions, handled cash flow in high-risk environments, and maintained a 98% customer retention rate despite a global pandemic and rising inflation. I mapped the traffic patterns of 5 major intersections to optimize delivery times. And I did it all while holding a butter tub. The room went silent. The interviewers exchanged a long look. What did you learn about people on those streets, Amara? The woman asked. I learned that everyone is hungry for something, Amara said, her mind flashing back to the pregnant woman in the SUV and the mechanic with the greasy hands. And if you provide it with dignity and a bit of butter, they will always come back to you. I also learned that you cannot wait for the rain to stop to get the work done. You have to learn how to swim in the mud. The Nigerian man leaned back, tapping his pen against the table. The test is tomorrow. Quantitative reasoning, situational logic, and a written essay. If you pass, the salary starts in USD. You'll be stationed in Abuja. Amara stood up. She didn't thank them. She didn't beg. She simply nodded. I'll be here, she said. As she walked out of the hall, she passed a trash can. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small, metal spoon she had used for 3 years to scoop margarine. She looked at it for a moment. The scratches, the worn handle, the history of her survival. She dropped it into the bin. The sound of the metal hitting the bottom was the loudest sound she had ever heard. It was the sound of a door closing. The girl who walked 3 paces behind was dead. The woman who would lead was just beginning to breathe. The transition from the humid, diesel-soaked air of Lagos to the dry, manicured silence of Abuja felt like waking up in a different country altogether. In late 2021, as the world finally shook off the last vestiges of the global standstill, Amara stepped off a plane at Nnamdi Azikiwe International Airport. She carried a single suitcase and a heart that had been cauterized by grief. She was no longer the girl with the butter tub. She was Amara Nkechi, Junior Logistics Coordinator for the Global Relief Organization, GRO. The Abuja office was a glass and steel monolith in Maitama, a district where the streets were so clean they looked scrubbed by hand and the trees were planted in perfect, obedient rows. On her first day, Amara stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 5th floor, looking out at the rolling hills of the FCT. She felt a strange, dizzying vertigo. For years, her horizon had been limited by the height of a bread tray and the 3 paces between her and her mother's heels. Now, the horizon was infinite, and it was terrifying. Her colleagues were a collection of the Nigerian elite, graduates from London, Toronto, and Harvard. They spoke in polished, transatlantic accents and spent their lunch breaks discussing cryptocurrency and the best brunch spots in Muse 2. Amara, right? A girl named Toby asked during the first week. Toby wore a silk blouse that probably cost more than Amara's mother had made in a year. Where did you do your undergrad? I don't recognize your ring. Amara looked down at her hands. The yellow stains of the margarine had finally faded, replaced by the pale marks of a woman who spent her days typing on a MacBook. I studied in the streets of Mushin, Amara said, her voice level. And I finished my exams in the rain. Toby laughed, thinking it was a trendy, metaphorical joke. Oh, I love that. So gritty. Very hustle culture of you. Amara didn't correct her. She didn't have the energy to explain that for her, gritty wasn't a brand. It was the taste of dust in her throat for 2 decades. While her colleagues relied on theoretical models and expensive software to track aid distribution to the Northeast, Amara relied on instinct. She knew that a supply truck wouldn't be delayed by logistical bottlenecks. It would be delayed because the driver's brother was getting married or because a specific police checkpoint was notorious for demanding cold water money. She began to outpace everyone. When a shipment of high-protein biscuits for a displacement camp in Maiduguri went missing, the Harvard boys spent 3 days on Zoom calls. Amara took a flight to the regional hub, walked into the warehouse, and identified the missing pallets within 2 hours. She knew exactly which corner of the room the lost goods would be tucked into, the same dark corners where the bakery owners in Lagos used to hide the extra loaves to drive up the price. By mid-2022, the temporals of her life had shifted into a high-speed blur of success. She was promoted to senior field director. She traded her worn wrappers for tailored blazers and her sandals for sharp, sensible heels. She moved into a small, sun-drenched apartment in Gwarinpa. Every morning, she would make herself a piece of toast. She would stare at the bread, the perfectly sliced, expensive sourdough from a boutique bakery, and she would think of the aged loaves. She would think of the blue tub. Sometimes, the silence of her beautiful apartment was so loud it made her ears ring. She was successful, she was safe, but she was profoundly alone. The girl who held the grease was gone, but the woman who signed the contracts felt like a ghost. It was a Tuesday evening in November. The Harmattan haze had begun to settle over Abuja, painting the sunset in shades of dusty orange and pale gold. Amara was representing GRO at a high-level gala for the Partners for African Development at the Transcorp Hilton. The room was a sea of black ties, evening gowns, and the clinking of champagne flutes. Amara felt like an imposter. She stood near a floral arrangement, nursing a glass of sparkling water, watching the big men of Nigeria laugh and trade favors. You look like you're calculating the exit velocity of this room, a voice said beside her. Amara turned. Standing there was a man who didn't fit the typical billionaire mold. He wasn't wearing an overflowing agbada or a stiff tuxedo. He wore a simple, expertly tailored dark suit with a turtleneck. He was handsome in a quiet, rugged way, with eyes that seemed to be looking at things rather than through them. I'm calculating the waste, Amara replied, surprised by her own honesty. The cost of the flowers in this room could fund 3 maternal health clinics in the Delta for a month. The man smiled. It wasn't a patronizing smile, it was one of recognition. And the cost of the champagne could probably buy a fleet of refrigerated trucks for vaccine delivery. I'm Julian. Amara. I know who you are, Amara Nkechi, Julian said. I read your report on the inefficiency of the last-mile delivery in Borno. It was brutal. Most people in this room write reports to sound smart. You wrote that report to get people fed. Amara felt a flush of heat in her cheeks. I don't like seeing things go to waste. Especially when people are waiting. They talked for 3 hours. Julian wasn't just a donor. He was the founder of a tech philanthropy firm that focused on agricultural supply chains. He was brilliant, but he was also grounded. He talked about his childhood in a modest neighborhood in Port Harcourt before his software took off. I noticed something about you, Amara, he said as the gala began to wind down. When the servers came around with the appetizers, you were the only person in this room who looked them in the eye and said thank you. Truly said it. Most people treat them like furniture. Amara looked at a young waiter passing by, his tray heavy with empty glasses. She saw the tension in his neck. She saw the way his thumb was hooked under the edge of the tray to keep it steady. She knew that thumb. She had been that thumb. I know what it's like to carry a tray that isn't yours, she said softly. Over the next few months, Julian became a permanent fixture in her life. He didn't woo her with flashy displays of wealth. Instead, he showed up at her office with a brown paper bag of proper street food from a vendor he'd found who reminded him of home. I know you miss the salt, he told her one evening as they sat on the trunk of his car, overlooking the city lights from Usuma Dam. He was the first person she told about the blue tub. She told him about the 3 paces. She told him about the taxi ride in the rain and the way her mother's hand felt when the life left it. She expected him to look at her with the same gritty fascination Toby had shown. Instead, Julian reached out and took her hand. His palm was warm and steady. Your mother didn't just sell bread, Amara, he said. She was a master of the most difficult craft in the world, endurance. You aren't successful despite that tray. You're successful because of it. You have the soul of a laborer and the mind of a strategist. That makes you the most dangerous woman in this city. By the end of 2021, as the harmattan intensified, Julian took her to a plot of land he had bought on the outskirts of the city. It was a sprawling, green expanse. I'm building a headquarters here, he said. For a new initiative. I want to digitize the entire informal market system in West Africa. No more lost pallets. No more disappearing inventory. I want to give the market women and the street hawkers the same tools the billionaires have. He turned to her, the wind whipping his hair. But I can't do it alone. I need someone who knows the rhythm of the streets and the logic of the boardroom. I need a partner. In the business, and in my life. He didn't get down on one knee. He simply stood before her, offering a partnership of equals. Amara, will you build this kingdom with me? Amara looked at the land. She thought of the Mushin gutters. She thought of the red dust of the Lagos roads. She thought of Mama Nkechi, who had told her to look at the university and never look back at the tray. On one condition, Amara said, her eyes wet but her voice firm. Anything. We don't just build a headquarters. We build a school on this site. A school for the children of the street sellers. And the first thing they learn won't be math or English. It will be that their hands, no matter how much grease or flour is on them, are the hands of kings and queens. Julian smiled, pulling her into an embrace that felt like the end of a very long walk. I think we can manage that. The story ends not with a happily ever after in a vacuum, but with a celebration of memory. Their wedding was the event of the year in Abuja, a blending of the tech elite and the humanitarian world. But the most talked about detail wasn't the 5-tier cake or the international performers. It was the centerpiece of the head table. In front of the billionaire groom and his brilliant, radiant bride, there sat a single, humble wooden tray. On it was a loaf of aged bread, unsliced and unadorned. Beside it sat a blue plastic tub, polished until it shone like a sapphire. As the toasts began, Amara stood up. She looked out at the crowd, at the ministers, the CEOs, and her former colleagues. Then, she looked at the back of the room, where the catering staff stood. She raised her glass to them first. To the ones who carry the weight, she toasted. May your trays never be too heavy, and may your path always lead you to the table. She sat down, her hand finding Julian's under the white linen cloth. For the first time since 2018, the scent of yeast didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a benediction. The yeast had risen, the bread was baked, and the girl from Mushin was finally, truly, home. The year 2021 was a ghost in the rearview mirror, and by the peak of the following seasons, the harmattan of Abuja had given way to a rain that felt cleansing rather than suffocating. Amara stood in the grand foyer of the newly completed Nkechi Legacy Center, a sprawling architectural marvel on the outskirts of the city. The walls were made of glass and polished earth, a fusion of modern technology and the soil that had once stained her mother's feet. This was the kingdom Julian had promised, but it wasn't a palace for them. It was a cathedral for the invisible. Amara walked through the corridors, her heels clicking against the granite floors. She stopped in front of the Gallery of Grit, a long hallway lined with high-definition portraits of market women from across West Africa. There were fishmongers from Accra, lace sellers from Kotona, and, in the center, a life-size charcoal sketch of a woman carrying a bread tray with the grace of a gazelle. She didn't have a name on the plaque. She was simply titled The Foundation. She would have hated the frame. A voice chuckled behind her. Amara turned to see Julian, his tie loosened, a tablet in his hand. He looked tired but radiant. She would have said the gold leaf on the frame could have bought 40 bags of flour. 50, Amara corrected him, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. And she would have been right. The final phase of their project, the Yeast Initiative, was launching that afternoon. It was the culmination of everything Amara had learned between the Mushin gutters and the Maitama boardrooms. They had developed an app that allowed street hawkers to track their inventory, access microloans without predatory interest, and, most importantly, connect directly to wholesalers. The data is coming in from Lagos, Julian said, showing her the screen. In Mushin alone, 300 bread sellers signed up this morning. Their profit margins are already up by 15% because we've bypassed the area boy tax at the distribution points. Amara looked at the glowing dots on the map of Nigeria. Each dot was a person. Each dot was a girl holding a butter tub, or a mother with a heavy tray. For the first time, they weren't just shadows in the traffic, they were nodes in a network of power. It's not just about the money, Julian, Amara said softly. It's about the time. We're giving them back an hour of their day. An hour to sit. An hour to breathe. An hour to look at their children's homework. As the launch event began, the gates of the center were open to the public. Amara insisted that there be no VIP section. The Minister of Trade sat next to a woman who sold roasted corn, and the CEO of a major bank shared a bench with a retired taxi driver. During the reception, Amara found herself near the refreshment table. She watched a young girl, perhaps 12 years old, staring at the assortment of pastries. The girl was wearing a faded yellow dress, and her hands were dusted with a familiar white powder. Do you like the rolls? Amara asked, crouching down to the girl's level. The girl jumped slightly, her eyes wide. Yes, Auntie, but they are too beautiful to eat. Amara reached out and took a small, warm roll from the silver platter. She broke it in half, the steam rising in a delicate plume. Bread is never too beautiful to eat. It is made to give us strength for the walk. As she handed the piece to the girl, a woman approached, the girl's mother. She was lean and weathered, her neck corded with the familiar muscles of a carrier. She looked at Amara, then at the expensive silk of Amara's dress, and then at her face. The woman froze. Her eyes moved to the Gallery of Grit and back to Amara. You. The woman whispered. You are the girl. The one who used to sell behind the bakery in Age. The scholar. Amara felt a chill of pure, crystalline recognition. I am Amara. The woman reached out, her fingers trembling as she touched the sleeve of Amara's blazer. My sister told me you went to the sky. We thought the wind had just blown you away. We didn't know you were building this for us. I didn't go to the sky, Amara said, her voice thick with emotion. I just climbed a different hill. But the view is the same. I still see you. The woman didn't ask for money. She didn't ask for a job. She simply took Amara's hand and pressed it to her cheek, the same way Mama Nkechi had done in the back of that rain-soaked taxi. It was a silent seal of a promise kept. As the sun began to set over the Abuja hills, the temporal markers of the story reached their final destination. The world had changed, borders had reopened, economies were limping back to life, and the masks were falling away. But for Amara, the true shift was internal. She walked out to the courtyard where a massive bronze sculpture stood. It wasn't a statue of a person, but of a single, giant seed cracking open. Julian joined her, handing her a glass of juice. What are you thinking about? I'm thinking about the day she died, Amara said. I used to think that was the day my life ended. But now I realize it was just the day the yeast was added to the dough. The heat of that tragedy, it's what made me rise. You did the work, Amara, Julian said. The yeast only works if the flour is strong. They stood together in the twilight, a couple who had turned their private grief into a public grace. The school they had built was already filled with the sounds of children shouting in the playground, children who would never know the weight of a wooden tray on their soft skulls. Amara looked up at the stars, which were beginning to pierce through the Abuja haze. She felt a phantom weight on her head, not the tray, but a crown of responsibility. She realized that being rich wasn't about the balance in her bank account or the luxury of her car. It was about the fact that she could now walk beside anyone, and behind no one. The final scene of the story takes us back to a small, quiet corner of the Nkechi Legacy Center. There is a small kitchen there, used for teaching culinary skills. Late at night, when the dignitaries have gone and the lights are low, Amara often goes there alone. She doesn't use the industrial mixers or the electric ovens. She pulls out a wooden bowl and a bag of local flour. She kneads the dough by hand, feeling the elastic pull of the gluten, the warmth of the friction. She adds the salt, the water, and the yeast. And as the bread begins to bake, filling the multi-million-dollar facility with the humble, unmistakable scent of a Mushin morning, Amara closes her eyes. In that scent, she finds her mother. In that scent, she finds the girl she used to be. And in the silence of the night, she hears the rhythmic, melodic cry of the streets, not as a ghost, but as a song of victory. The story of the bread seller was over. The story of the queen had begun.